Jordan and Sophie had been together for 7 years, with 5 of those as a married couple. Their daughter Alice was 3 when Sophie finally went back to work. She was so thrilled to return to her former routine that her husband joked, asking if he hadn't kept her confined for the entire 3 years. In the winter, during the alumni meeting season, her school friend Annabelle called and mentioned they were organizing a reunion this year. "It's our 10-year anniversary, Sveta. Are you coming? I'll save a spot for you." Sophie eagerly accepted. Their once close-knit class had spread out across the country, and they hadn't seen each other in ages. Now they had the perfect opportunity to reunite. Annabelle provided the details about the date, time, and the restaurant for the gathering. Sophie thanked her friend for the invitation and hung up. On the appointed day, Sophie came to the restaurant early. Soon she was joined by other visitors, and she noticed their geography teacher, Adam. Sophie couldn't help but remember how in love she was with him in high school. "How are you doing? What is it?" she asked, going outside to smoke. Adam was sitting next to her. Under the influence of alcohol, Sophie felt like a naive 16-year-old girl in love with her teacher. He still looked interesting and handsome, and age only added to his charm. Despite being married for 5 years, Sophie held up her hand, showing off her engagement ring. Sophie didn't understand why she did that. As soon as the words left her mouth, she felt a wave of discomfort. Was being married really something to brag about? "I always knew you'd do well in life." Adam smiled. Sophie remembered how much she adored that kind, disarming smile. A shiver ran down her spine. She longed to touch Adam and embrace him. But Sophie held back, reminding herself that she was a married woman and couldn't indulge in every temptation. Annabelle returned, and Adam moved away. Sophie poured herself another glass of wine and downed it quickly, then followed it with another. Though her former teacher sat far from her, she kept an eye on him the whole evening. Her foggy mind conjured up amusing thoughts that made her giggle. Annabelle, sitting beside her, looked at her curiously. "What's so funny?" she asked. "Nothing," Sophie replied. "I'm going out for a smoke." She got up on unsteady legs and stepped outside. The cold air cleared her head a bit, bringing her back to her senses. Inside, she was torn. Part of her urged her to call a taxi and go home to her husband and child, while the other part wanted to stay and get closer to Adam. "Smoking again, Sophie," a stern voice called from behind. Sophie turned to see Adam smiling. He lit a cigarette and took a drag. Their proximity was intoxicating to Sophie. "Are you married?" she asked suddenly, surprising even herself. He shook his head. "Divorced." The wine made Sophie's decision for her. She flicked her cigarette butt into the trash and stepped close to Adam, locking eyes with him. He was just as intoxicated, maybe even more so, but that didn't matter. She could always blame it on the alcohol, she thought, as she kissed her former crush. To her surprise, he didn't push her away. Instead, he held her tightly in his strong arms. Meanwhile, her purse, left hanging lonely on her chair, had a phone that rang incessantly with calls from her husband. When Adam suggested going to his place, she didn't hesitate. But at 2 a.m, guilt gnawed at her. She called a taxi and rushed home. On the way, she rehearsed explanations to ensure Jordan wouldn't suspect anything. The affair between the former student and teacher dragged on for several months. Sophie was completely swept off her feet. Jordan noticed the change in his wife, but couldn't pinpoint it. On one hand, she was calmer, more agreeable, and less argumentative. On the other hand, she seemed distant, colder, and more closed off. It frightened him. One evening, he told her he was going out to a bar with friends. Sophie, happy to be alone, let him go easily. "You always used to argue before," Jordan remarked. She smiled. "I've grown up, I guess," she replied. Jordan wanted to believe that was true. At the bar, his friends Adrian, Cameron, and Adrian's colleague Adam were already waiting. The evening was lighthearted. Beer flowed freely, and the waitresses struggled to keep up with their orders. Adam kept getting distracted by his phone, smiling foolishly and typing messages all evening. Cameron finally asked what was going on with his personal life. "A new woman," Adam laughed. "Show us." The group cheered Adam on. At first he refused, saying that it was indecent and that he did not want everyone to see his girlfriend like that. But in the end, he gave up and put his phone on the table with the screen up. There was silence at the table. Jordan stared at the screen without blinking. On the screen was a photo of his wife, Sophie, wearing his favorite red lingerie, posed indecently. Jordan, one of the men, started quietly, covering the phone with his hand. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Adam, not understanding, looked from one man to another. Everyone looked as if someone had just died, and Adam was clueless. "My beloved sent it to me," he replied. "That's my wife," Jordan roared, slamming his fists on the table with such force that beer splashed from the glasses. "Do you understand?" he yelled at Adam. Adam, stunned, was at a loss for words. A conflict was brewing and was inevitable. The betrayed husband lunged at his wife's lover, knocking over a chair. The sound of breaking dishes, the shrieks of nearby girls, and the shouts of the staff filled the bar. Before security could intervene, Jordan managed to land several punches on Adam, leaving him with a bleeding nose. "You're coming with me," Jordan said, breathing heavily. Adam tried to protest, but to no avail. Jordan was determined. They took a taxi and rode in silence, Jordan glaring at the phone. His wife had never sent him such photos. Sophie sat in the kitchen, wearing the red lingerie and a silk robe over it. She sipped wine and listened to music. Her thoughts swirled like a storm. She pondered what to do about the situation. Should she confess to her husband, or should she end the affair and forget it like a beautiful dream? She took another sip of wine. The key turned in the door lock. Sophie glanced at the clock. Strange, Jordan was home so early. The sight that greeted her was shocking. Standing at the door were the two men she loved. Both looked far from their best, with disheveled clothing and Adam sporting a dried bloodstain under his nose. A difficult conversation loomed. The apartment they lived in belonged to Sophie and her parents. After the divorce, Jordan had to move out. He stayed with Cameron for a while, and later rented a small apartment in another district. He tried to maintain a good relationship with his daughter and communicated with his ex-wife only about necessary matters. The pain of her betrayal still lingered. In truth, things with Adam didn't work out for Sophie either. After a few years together, she began to notice lipstick marks on his shirts and a faint smell of women's perfume she didn't use. They continued living together because Adam promised to change, swearing it wouldn't happen again. When Sophie finally grew tired of crying into her pillow at night, she kicked out her former teacher and stayed to live with her daughter alone.